Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it 1 minute just for everybody to join that might be connecting right now. So we'll give it just a minute and then we will officially get started. Probably not quite a minute, but I think we're in good shape to start. So I'll kick things off. I am Blake Davidson from Real Response, our Executive Vice President. I'm excited for this conversation today, safeguarding in sport. We have an amazing panel. I know it's going to be a fantastic conversation. We certainly are excited to get into that. Before I do want to acknowledge that we have over 300 people that have registered for today's webinar. Most assuredly, we have survivors that are joining us as part of this conversation. So we certainly commend their courage in coming forward and being part of finding ways to obviously eliminate the problems that we've had and the challenges around safeguarding in general. So a special welcome to all of those survivors there. I know the panelists can certainly jump in here with their thoughts on that too, but we're privileged at Real Response to have this opportunity to help facilitate this conversation and appreciate everyone's efforts around this important cause. So with that, I will just a quick background on Real Response, then we'll dive right into our panelists, the most important part of the conversation. So Real Response, for those that don't know, we're a two-way anonymous communication platform. We really focus on that two-way component, creating a dialogue, a conversation around important topics like safeguarding. We work with 200 plus organizations across professional sports, national governing bodies, federations, safeguarding units, you name it, kind of across the board. So we're excited to be part of this conversation, facilitating it. Most importantly, we are very honored to have the panelists that we have here, an amazing group. Frankly, I couldn't think of a better group to be part of this conversation. We have both a survivor and athlete perspective. We have a lifelong advocate. We've got law enforcement background represented as well, and child protection. Just really any kind of practice you could think of, expertise in this space. I think we've got it covered. So with that, I will turn it over to our illustrious panel, and I'll just kind of go off of my screen here and we'll do panelist introduction. So Anne, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks very much, Blake, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join you all today. I'm Anne Tebus. I'm the chair and one of the founders of Safe Sport International, which is a global charity that seeks to has a vision of everyone, everywhere safe in sport to experience safe and inclusive environments. Thank you.
Mari.
Hi, I'm Mari McLennan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Caniska Advocacy. We're a UK-based athlete and lived experience-led safe sport organisation, and I'm also an athlete, given that I work at this organisation. I run in athletics, and I specialise in the half and full marathon.
Thank you, Mari. And I've been following along in your training and some of your events. You're doing amazing. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Glenn.
Good morning from Texas. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I probably am the only American out of our three panelists. Spent many years in law enforcement, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but now the Chief Safeguarding Officer here at Scouting America, out of our headquarters near Dallas. Great to be here. Thank you, Blake.
Thank you very much. Thank you all again for your participation. So as we sort of start off, I think, let's start, Anne, you mentioned, you really, this has been your life's work, honestly. And, we can kind of go down the line here, but what's kind of motivated you to make safeguarding your life's work and child protection? And we'll just kind of go down the line of how you've kind of gotten to this point.
Thank you. For me, it's bringing the two kind of passions in my life together. It's both safeguarding and sport. I think For me, it sits with a deep sense of injustice as a child, seeing discrimination and prejudice. Also, being aware of a classmate who was self-harming and not knowing why, not understanding, and being too young to know what this was all about, and finding out later that her father was in prison for abuse. My favourite uncle was a social worker. I became fascinated by what he was doing, and my family was always involved in sport. And the two passions came together. When I started working in social work. Um, I gradually began to see the connections with sport and sport, children being failed in sport as well as children being failed in their families. So that's the source really of my passion. And the opportunity came 25 years ago to join them together when the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children set up its child protection in sport unit. So that's the heart of where it joins up.
Fantastic. Mari, I know many will know your story, many will not, but would love to hear from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's some familiar faces, names in the room today. I guess my why is that I've suffered abuse in sport myself. I experienced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse at the hands of my coach that I was with when I was at university from age 18. And it took a lot of campaigning and public exposure to try and work towards a lifetime ban for this coach. The national governing body had initially issued a 5-year ban. And through that experience, I saw so many shortcomings in the system, both in the way that we allow and facilitate abuse of children and young people, and actually people of all ages, in the name of sport and in the name of success, but also how reporting mechanisms favor the perpetrator, add additional harm, and that we're actually also favoring the institution, and that has to change. And so I have Kate, our co-founder, the co-founder of Kaniska Advocacy, and I have set up this organization to try and change that, both through the support service that we run, but also through the sort of continual advocacy that we do alongside each and every person that comes through our doors.
Thank you. Glenn.
Yeah, Blake, I'll try and keep this fairly short, but I did have a over 3-decade career in law enforcement, working for Her Majesty the Queen, but in various different UK agencies. I spent the first half of that 3 decades more focused in general and serious organized crime, principally combating the cocaine trade. And certainly for the UK folks, they'll be aware of a case in Portugal with the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And that case was a little bit of a sliding doors moment for me. Previous to that, I had arrested dangerous pedophiles, but that case and being so close to it, I was the UK liaison officer in Portugal when Madeleine went missing, was a bit of a sliding doors moment. And probably from that moment to this, I've become a lot more focused in and around child protection and in prevention. Over many of those years, the last 18 years or so, some in capacity building, but some causing the arrest of dangerous pedophiles at scale. And of course, I know we'll get into this, but I think this is such a delicate topic for those who don't know, right? And I think the phrase "the greatest trick the devil ever pulled," right, was pretending that he didn't exist. And these dangerous criminals do exist, and if we don't acknowledge that, empower people with the right information, and enforce the barriers that work, then organizations, sport, elsewhere, schools, youth serving organizations are destined to fail. So I'm really interested to get into some of the discussion. If I can just add as well, Blake, I just want to support your comment with regards to the importance of recognizing survivors. I know we have a survivor on the panel. In scouting, we work both with child protection experts and with survivors of abuse in scouting. So in one of our committees, a youth protection committee, we have a survivors of abuse, and we are fully transparent with those survivors with regards to everything we're doing in the prevention space. And those survivor voices are critical to us. making sure we learn from the mistakes of the past so that we can have a better future. So I'll leave it there with regards to survivors, because I'm sure we could spend the whole session talking about their importance, but I just wanted to back you up on that.
Well, thank you, Glenn. And I attended the conference that Glenn put on last year around child protection with a number of leaders in the space. And obviously the most moving moments were having those survivors get up and tell their stories and be part of that conversation. So they're, the most critical part of the conversation. Let's shift into some questions that we've received and I know are just important in general. And Mari, I'll start with you. I've watched a number of interviews with yourself, with Kate. I certainly commend you on what you've built with Kaniska advocacy across the board. And I think were you 4 or 5 years in now to that journey?
Yeah, 4.5, somewhere in between there.
Yeah, amazing. And one of the, there's many challenges I know to establishing that organization, but I also know you've encountered a number of challenges just in general when it comes to safeguarding. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, when you're comes to implementing a safeguarding program, what some of those challenges are. One thing I was taken aback by, honestly, was the fact that you would think everyone would say, absolutely, we have to have a safeguarding program and it has to have real teeth behind it. But the red carpet was not rolled out for you and Kate when you first started this. And I know there were a number of not only were people not welcoming, but they might have even been adversarial to what you were trying to accomplish. But I just love to hear your thoughts around kind of the challenges in general.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think at the time that we came forward, we incidentally were sort of swept up in a wave of change, perhaps, for the sort of safeguarding sector. It obviously wasn't evident to me at the time. I was very much caught up in my own case and reporting the abuse that I suffered. But it came around the same time as Athlete A. It came around the same time as the kind of explosion and public exposure around abuse in gymnastics. But I think now we are in a different place off the back of that. I think we are in a place where many sports likely would say that they want a safeguarding program in place. I think where we're not at yet is the second part of what you said. We don't necessarily want to put teeth behind it. And I think there are loads of reasons why this is an issue. First of all, it's always been an issue. Like, safeguarding in sport has always been critical, and actually safeguarding young and vulnerable people and people from marginalized groups has always been an issue. I think it's just now that it's getting more public exposure and we're talking about it, and it's, I guess, becoming a sector where there's academic theory and work behind it, and we're able to kind of make more robust, structured, perhaps evidence-based arguments for it. But I think at the basis of it, this is important because it's a human issue and we need to treat people with respect and dignity. I think that's always been true. I think the challenges that we're facing now are probably less. I think that the ideological sales pitch has been done. I would say most people agree that safeguarding is important, that we need to put people first. But I think ultimately there are a lack of resources, firstly, both financial and human. Many safeguarding teams aren't fully trained, they're not fully staffed. A lot of people are working part-time. In the UK, I know that a lot of case management groups are actually voluntary. And that's a huge issue, because ultimately, if we're not paying people for their time, it's really hard for them to prioritize that. And it also leaves people feeling tired, exhausted, and exploited. And we maybe don't have a diverse range of voices, because also the type of people or the profile of person that can do unpaid labor fits a particular profile. It doesn't allow for diversity. The reason that we're tight, financially, is because sport is meritocratic and funding structures are based on medals. And so until that changes, it's very hard again for sports to commit to putting funding behind safeguarding, because again, we don't have the evidence to show that to prioritize safeguarding and safe sport is to prioritize human beings, which will lead to success. That kind of argument is being made. It's beginning to kind of come to the foreground, but I think we're still some way away from that being really a convincing argument for the leaders in the space. And when I say leaders in the space, I mean leaders of sports governing bodies and national governing bodies. There's also like no standard sector-wide requirement to do particular things. So if I take the UK as an example, because it's particularly bitty, sport is a devolved matter, which means that each of our home nations have different legislations, different legal requirements, and different choices when it comes to safeguarding. Athletes don't exist in a vacuum of their home nation. So if you are an athlete, you exist in the whole of the UK, but it's not evident, there's not enough awareness or education that when you change country for a competition, or if you have a coach from a different nation, your rights are different and who you report to is different and how you will be treated is different. And so at the moment, essentially, your safety and enjoyment in sport is a postcode lottery, and also the sport that you fall into. So I would say, yeah, those are kind of the three key challenges that I think the sector faces: is the lack of resources, both human and financial, no sector-wide standardization or regulation, and medal-driven funding structures, meaning that we are kind of a success at all costs mindset in sport is dominant.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you kind of drill down into that and the different levels, and even on a sport basis, that there is no standard. I know oftentimes, we do hear that, that it's a case of the haves and the have-nots, and those that have the resources may or may not put the resources against safeguarding. Oftentimes, unfortunately, it takes a tragic incident for those resources to come forward. And would love to hear your thoughts on the same topic.
And I'd echo Mari's experience, but also say internationally, we're still at ground zero for most organisations in terms of dealing with the challenges. And part of that is because sport has sat outside the mainstream of dealing with child protection and safeguarding for so long. I mean, we'll come on later to what can we learn from other organisations, but there's a real need for a common understanding and a common sense of framework for not only what you need to do to make sport great for children particularly. In fact, one thing I did want to say was that most children don't start leaving sport from really, really high-end experiences. They leave because it's miserable. They're not enjoying it, that people shout at them, that coaching isn't tailored towards including them in sport. And it's the culture within clubs that often is the leaving point way before we get to a culture. Well, that culture also enables the worst things to happen as well. So I think there's a lot more to be done around thinking about what we need to learn from public sector, NGOs and so on, about creating positive environments. And child protection work started. I was looking something up from an ISPCAN, that's the International Society for the Prevention of Cruelty and Neglect. I got an email through the other day, and I remembered going to one of their first ever conferences. They have nearly 50 years of experience of research and evidence and stuff for us to learn from. And I think bridging that gap between the sports sector and every other sector that surrounds a child. I mean, children live in an environment with their parents, their immediate family, their extended families, health professionals, education, everyone who can be eyes and ears. And sport has sat too far away from that. So building those connections, I think, is really, really important. Then we've got multiple barriers to people trying to work in this area at the moment for all of the reasons that Mari mentioned. It's under-resourced around the world. There is not a common understanding of what we mean by safeguarding. For some people, it's a more holistic approach, which includes prevention, making the best environments, and responding appropriately. For others, it's cast in fear of the worst things that will happen to people when they're in sport, because we know the door is open now. We can't go back. We know that there are areas of sport that are not safe. There is not a governing body. There is not a sport that's immune to it. So we need to get stuck into that. I think the awareness level is now raised, but there's a long, long way to go.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Anna said there. Like, there are so many sports that just don't think that this is their issue. It's not their bag. It's not their responsibility. And we see that now more and more. In fact, because there is a raised awareness and people are potentially reporting more often, there are higher cases being reported of low-level concerns, which I actually hate the phrase. I usually prefer using red flag behaviors, but whatever. I think that I'm now seeing through our support service that there are organizations, sports governing bodies, putting policies in place to deter people from coming forward because they don't want to deal with it. So they're kind of narrowing the scope of their codes of conduct. They're narrowing the scope of what they will actually manage. And again, that goes back to Anne's point on what is safeguarding, what is classified as safeguarding. And I think, you know, in the UK, we talk about safeguarding adults, but actually many organizations will talk about safeguarding as only pertaining to children under the age of 18. There's no recognition of the vulnerability for individuals between the ages of 18 and 25 when your prefrontal cortex has not finished developing. You do not have that same rational thinking capability that adults over that age have. And also, across the globe, so many people at that age, that's when they're becoming professionals in their sport. So they might be taking that next step and moving away from home for that. Or they're moving to university, and so they're away from support systems, close circles. They are more vulnerable, and sport just wants to wash its hands of their responsibility.
Yeah, no, for sure. We definitely encounter that. Glenn, I definitely want to move to you here and get your thoughts on this. Before I do, I know we're getting a number of questions coming in for our panelists, so we'll definitely circle back to those at the end. So keep the questions coming. We certainly appreciate that. And Glenn, I know we're talking about sport, but there's so much commonality here between, when it comes to youth and child protection and the work that you're doing across the board, standards, those types of things. So I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these challenges as well.
Yeah, there's so much there from what Anne and Mari were discussing. One point in particular, well, 2 points. As you know, Blake, I'd rather not make just 1 point when I can make two. First is that it's beyond naive. It's dangerous to presume you don't have risk, right? To Anne's point, the only organizations that have no risk are those with no people, right? You've just got to have your arms around that. Of course, at my level, but my boss is the CEO. Like the CEO, the C-suite, those folks need to A, get it, and B, talk about it. And if they're not, frankly, they're part of the problem. The only way to have no risk is to have no people. And to Mari's point, identifying those barrier violations, those red flags, yellow or red flags actually, is the thing that helps with prevention. And I think sometimes that gets lost with people, right? A good friend of mine, I wish this was my phrase, but he says, what we're doing really is we're smoke detectors, not firefighters. And those yellow and red flags, enforcing those barriers are absolutely the thing that helps with abuse prevention, not just sexual abuse, but other forms of abuse as well, bullying, yelling at kids, and all that kind of thing. That has to be addressed consistently, and hopefully we'll come on to, I see some of the questions with regards to parents as well, and parents play a role. So hopefully we can have time to answer that later. But we often talk about, our part of a triangle, Scouting America, policies, training, and all the rest of it. The youth themselves and the parent. And the youth, when I say the youth themselves, that is more about empowering information. It's not putting the responsibility onto youth, of course not, but it is about making sure they have the right information and they know what to do.
Thank you, Glenn. And Glenn touched on this a little bit. It's been touched on a bit through the conversation, but the point of support from leadership and also collaboration, the point that you touched on earlier, I think is so important here. Either, kind of what's working with collaborating with other organizations on a topic like safeguarding, what's not working, and then just the empowerment of these organizations. It's one thing, goes back to that first question about, it's one thing to have a policy around safeguarding, but not putting teeth behind it. But if leadership doesn't believe and they're not empowering those to enforce the policies, then there's a number of challenges around that. But big question around collaboration and leadership, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I think it speaks to what I started mentioning earlier, which is we must have a multi-agency and multidisciplinary approach to dealing with this. One of the challenges, I think, I'll speak to first to my experience in the UK early on when we were starting this work. A huge amount of emphasis was placed on sports organisations having safeguarding leads, having training for people in safeguarding key roles, and nowhere near enough, I would say, that did we do in terms of leadership and engaging with leadership. Unless you have a across your sport approach to safeguarding that recognises that safeguarding is every single person in your organisation's responsibility. They're just different responsibilities. And if leadership doesn't put the values and principles into action in terms of their behaviours, how they treat people, then we're going to continue to have problems. And we do have to face a reality that unfortunately although there are some fantastic leaders in sport, there are many that are actually part of the problem. Part of the problem in terms of not believing in the issue, and part of the problem because they may actually be abusers themselves. They may be bullies, they may be engaged in violent behaviour. And we know from many cases in the last couple of years, people have lost their lives in those circumstances. So we have to recognise that whilst we may wish everybody to be on side with what we're doing, there are people who are actively against it. So leadership teams are really, really critical in sharing the load across the organisation, developing an understanding that every one person, whether you're the administrator who picks up the phone and needs to know who do I pass this on to, whether I'm the grounds person who might spot something when they're showing kids around a tour, whether they're referees, officials, and coaches, everyone has a role to play. And leadership needs to model the culture, walk the walk, put the resources in place, because the consequences of not doing so are incalculably more than the resource investment in doing something.
And we talk a lot about some of the shortcomings, and I know there's a question now that was posed around just the UK specifically not having a neutral, independent body. I know I've heard Anne speak about this, and Mari speak about this. So I want to touch on that, and then kind of a follow up to that is: are there organizations? There are that are doing it well, not the ones that are doing it poorly, but who's doing a good job? And just in your mind, from a structure standpoint, where should we be going? And anyone can take that.
When you say, sorry, just to clarify, when you say who's doing a good job, do you mean sports organizations, or do you mean
organizations, federations, safeguarding bodies that, or is there a model out there? We can speak to the UK's case of not having an independent body or a neutral body in this case, but maybe there are countries, federations, others that, there is a good model out there. Again, it's not something that is finite. They've done it, they've accomplished it, and we've gotten to the end of it. But we do talk a lot about the shortcomings. I want to talk about that. So what are the challenges around that? But also, are there models we can look to as part of this conversation? So
I guess to tackle the question of the UK not having a sort of single entity of safe sport, there has been some scoping work done. We were involved in the working group for that. I would say there are multiple issues as to reasons why, arguments that are made as to why we don't have one. I completely agree. I read the question around that ultimately the current system means that the regulation that is in place is ultimately very biased. It protects the institution, and they're a law unto themselves. It depends who they're funded by. If they're funded by sports councils, there are some power levers you can pull there, but so often we're working with individuals in the support service where we get to a point ultimately where the sanction that has been delivered is not appropriate for what has been the sort of abuse that has been perpetrated. And you do reach a sort of barrier, and ultimately the last option is to go to the media, go to a journalist, so that person has their voice heard and that there's some exposure, but it shouldn't have to get to that. I think the reasons why the UK doesn't have a single entity is ultimately political in a way. You know, we have 4 devolved nations here. We've got kind of 4 separate governments trying to work together. There's been a lot of pushback from Scotland. I say that as someone from Scotland, and that it frustrates me. I think each nation thinks that they've come up with their own solution to that. And I know that in Scotland we have got an independent case management service that sports can lean on if they need that support, but it's not there's no standard setting, there's not kind of a unified policy, there's not like a sort of this is what safeguarding means in the UK and these are the standards we believe we need to meet. It's very the whole sector is very siloed, it's very broken up, and ultimately we do need that. I really strongly believe that there should be a single point of access for reporting. There should be standardized education. There needs to be like a sort of standardized training providers as well, so that we can quality control what people are learning, what kind of qualifications and knowledge coaches have, practitioners have, parents have, athletes have. We're really, really far away from that. I know lots of people may disagree with me, but I think that there are good things to be learned from what's been done and being done in Canada. They have, but I don't think, to your question, I don't think that there's an example of a perfect system. I don't think we're there globally at all, but I think that different pockets are doing things that we want to push to get more of, or we want to go a bit further than. So for example, in Canada, I'm aware that one of the things we want to get in the UK is a register of a workforce register. So you can see what people are working in the space. You can see whether or not people have sanctions. You can see what people specialize in. It's kind of like LinkedIn, but for people who work in sport. Namely, so that we can find out which coaches have bans against them or have been investigated against. In Canada, this does exist, but you can't, it's not publicly accessible. So you have to know that it exists and you have to request access. So I think that in that way, there are pockets of good practice, and we just need to keep going further. We need to keep pushing to get to the place where we need to be. And I think that conversation needs to be led by people like Anne, who have been in this sector for such a long time and have seen the progress, but know exactly where the gaps are, but also needs to be led by survivors who are not just there to tokenistically tell their story, but also who have literally lived the shortcomings of the system. And my experience will only be relevant for so long, because the gaps that I experienced will hopefully be filled, and it'll be someone else's turn to take that baton and pass on and tell us, actually, the system is still flawed. These are the gaps. This is what's not working. So I've not really answered your question in terms of where good practice is, but I think that there are pockets of it, and Anne will know better from an international perspective.
Thanks, Mari. But what I will say is that I'm not going to single out any organisation for doing it well. We're all on a learning journey at the moment, and there are some things that need completely turning on their head. There are, however, frameworks out there that exist. So international safeguards for children in sport, international safeguards for adults in sport, and we're working from SSI point of view on a bridging piece around young people moving into talent pathways. But they're not all well known everywhere. They're very under-resourced in terms of people being able to get access to help and support to develop the work that they're doing. But also we've got one of the things that gives me hope is 2 major pieces of work that are happening to try and bridge the gaps between statutory sector and sport sector, developing international frameworks. So at the moment, UNESCO is working with ministries around a model for statutory ministries, for governments to take hold of the issue. My view is that shouldn't just be sport, that should be a multidisciplinary approach as well, involving justice, health, education, and so on. And the International Olympic Committee is developing an international framework as well, very well embedded in terms of survivor and athlete voices in that process currently. And I think that's going to be the heart of potentially making the difference. But there's a need to connect up all of those different initiatives and frameworks. Many are geared towards elite sport at the moment that are developing, but I'm also seeing there's some European projects at the moment which are focused on grassroots toolkits, and developing grassroots toolkits and resources to work with parents, communities and clubs where most sports taking place. So I have some optimism about that, but we have to come together. Nobody can solve these problems on their own. We've seen that for nearly 50 years since Henry Kempe first spotted child battering and named it as a pediatrician in Denver and created that international sport network. We need to make sure that sport and the statutory sector and NGOs are all coming together and centering around who we serve. Sports organisations serve their participants, and anything that's built should be built around that with the athletes. And also, I would say people in other roles as well that need support to have a safe environment. It doesn't matter whether you're a child, an adult, and what role you're in. It all needs a safe and enjoyable and inclusive experience.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Glenn, any closing thoughts on that area of conversation?
Really just that I think both Anne and Mari have touched on this. And I know you weren't suggesting it, Blake, but there is no gold standard because it is a journey. It really is. And I always worry if anyone says they are the gold standard. So I'm like, really? You've got nothing to learn in this space? So that terrifies me. Quick shout out for actually Safe Sport Canada, because a good friend of mine is the executive director. She's a wonderful woman, Signe Arnson. So I know they will go from strength to strength under her leadership. So.
Yeah, and Glenn, if it's one thing you've taught me along the way over the years, is that safeguarding is not a destination, it's a journey. So and we have to continue that. And with that, I'll transition a bit here into the areas of prevention and some of the tools that you're seeing that again are kind of helping in that effort. What the other thing that's resonated with me over the years, and I've heard you speak about this, I've heard you at the conference talk about this, is the fact that the abusers, the bad actors out there are the early adopters when it comes to finding ways to, whether it's leverage technology or do bad things, and just keeping up with that as an organization. And we're talking about standards here. The standards are always sort of shifting, and bad people are figuring out the loopholes and where to go first. But just your thoughts on prevention or any of that would be certainly interesting to hear.
Yeah, so I'll start off really with regards to bad people, right? Like I think rightly sometimes people will say, hey, bad guys, criminals, they go where the children are, right? And whilst that's somewhat true in the online space, gaming, anywhere there are kids online, criminals will be as well, okay? But that's not often how people who become criminals start off, right? In the teaching profession, in sports and youth serving organizations, they didn't always intend to be a criminal, right? Weak policies, weak barriers, that's what led, in some cases at least, to these folks committing crimes. And so when we think sometimes about these predators, right, you'll hear words like predators or these guys are monsters. I think sometimes there's a danger there in missing the wood for the trees, by which I mean some of these guys and women are professional in terms of their grooming and what they do. And they are good guys. They are really good with kids. They are really good with people around them, right? Because they're in the professional grooming business. There's a phrase about a criminal, and he was later found to have abused dozens and dozens of athletes, a guy called Jerry Sandusky here in the US. And what someone said about Jerry Sandusky is, it's like he was put on this earth to work with children. I've never seen a man so gifted in working with children, right? Because Jerry Sandusky was a professional groomer. So the trust that he built up around himself with regards to his treatment of children and how he worked with them, because he was really good at working with children, but he also abused them, right? So I think sometimes when we use words like predator and monster, we risk making them others, not people who are right there in your community already. And I think we really need to focus on the fact that when we talk about predators testing barriers to get in, we also need to be mindful of the people who are already in, right? And again, this is an uncomfortable topic, but we just need to get our arms around it and appreciate that there is a certain percentage of people who have a sexual interest in children. And without the proper barriers in place, without the proper empowerment in place, they will act on that sexual interest. Like we just need to know that, and again, for folks in the UK, they'll know the Forth Bridge. I talk about here in the United States, there's a bridge in Scotland called the Forth Bridge, and we're always painting it because it's so long. But in terms of what we do, it's also like having a bridge and people walking along it, because you're always getting new people coming into sports and youth serving organizations and schools and elsewhere. So it's a constant procession of new folks that need to have the education, right?
And Mary, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'd very much want to push the education piece. Education and awareness are critical, and we have huge gaps in that around the world. And as Mari said, there's not a consistency to that. There's increasing investment in it, but if I had to spend sort of 90% of my budget in sport on something to do with safeguarding, it would be education and awareness raising and supporting people to, first of all, know what is a good environment for children, what's a good coaching environment for children, what's the best learning environment for children. Providing education to parents is massively important when we talk about a public health approach to this work, which is what it should be. Parents are key in terms of making sure they know what they should expect from sport, that it's not a babysitting service. Don't leave your child at the door and assume it's going to be okay. Make sure you get involved, find out about your what's happening in your sport, and find out what questions you should be asking. I will put a big shout out. The Child Protection in Sport unit in the UK is leading its Parents in Sport Week again. It's a great engagement tool, and I know loads of people from around the world now get involved with it. But everybody in sport has a role to play. Everybody needs education and support. The other thing that we also, I think, need to turn on our head is we know that our models for response need shifting as well. I don't know if we want to stop moving on to that now, but we can't be basing our models on failed criminal justice systems, because in terms of offences, particularly the most serious offences around child abuse and abuse of adults, the conviction rate is something like 2 or 3%, and so many models in sport are being based on a model that isn't accessible to people, isn't accessible to victims. The language is not appropriate. It's hard to navigate it. So everything we do in terms of prevention and response needs to be better understood by people, better communicated, and accessible to people. But the education piece is critical.
Can I just add, Blake?
Yes.
I love what Anne said there, because I think sometimes people get overly comfortable and say, "Well, we do a criminal background check." It's like, yeah, look, that's the minimum standard. The minimum standard. It's not what prevents abuse, and you know there are around about 11 steps between somebody being sexually exploited and a criminal conviction that leads to any kind of criminal background. You know, from realizing as a victim that you were exploited all the way through. So I get worried when people say, "Oh, well, we do a criminal background check," as if that is in of itself a prevention tool. It's the minimum I would expect an organization to do, right? It's not. So anyway, sorry, and I hear it a lot, and I'm like always pushing back against it, because the empowerment thing is what really counts.
I think to pick up on two of those points, like I would say a criminal background check's not even the bare minimum. It's like less than, it's bars on the floor, if that's where we're aiming for. But I think on that education piece, like to me, education is the minimum. Like that's where we should be aiming. And I think to Anne's point, educating about healthy environments is one thing. And every time we're working in this space, it feels like we need to push further. You'll see organizations where they're like, oh, well, we've embedded safeguarding training into all levels of our coaching qualifications now. Well, that's great, but it always feels like we're chasing our tail in this space. And one of the biggest things that it feels almost like it's a desperate need to educate on is just around the culture. And I think this is maybe less appropriate because I know that not everybody in this room will be here because of safeguarding in sport, but the cultures within sport that like facilitate, normalize, and almost excuse abuse is really where we need to be targeting action. We need to be educating parents and athletes, even young children, around how we need to change these cultures. Because if we don't do that, people are going to accept abusive practices and toxic training environments. And that starts at grassroots. Every single elite athlete has been a grassroots child athlete. Maybe not every single, I'm sure there's exceptions to that rule, but the vast majority. And, you know, where we have cultures in sport where, you know, we have this ideology that honestly harks back to like ancient Olympics, where sporting prowess is equal to moral virtue. And therefore, if you are facilitating successful athletes, or if you yourself are a successful athlete, then you are morally exempt from any wrongdoing that you commit. We saw this last year with the convicted rapists of a child who went to the Olympics, and there was moral outrage for sure, but their governing body and the IOC stayed silent and allowed this person to compete. It's so evident at every stage. We keep getting told by sport that it doesn't matter what you've done or what you do to people to cause harm if you're good at sport. And that is built into everything. And I think we're told from such a young age, like I remember being told age 9 in a coaching environment, be a coachable athlete, don't question authority. You know, you'd hear coaches talking about and complaining about the uncoachable athlete, and that kind of confusion of, yes, you need to comply, but also you need to suffer. That it's like a perfect storm. We're molding people to be targetable victims for perpetrators who are in sport, and it causes so much harm. And then we don't allow people to speak up. We almost assume that everything is fine until an athlete speaks up or the victim speaks up. And every time it happens, everyone in that community will say, oh, well, knew they were dodgy. Yeah, we had a feeling. And until these cultures, until we start creating better, healthier, more positive cultures where we value people. And Anne said earlier, you know, that sports organizations are there to serve their participants. I don't think they've understood that. They have not understood that at all. Athletes are like, they think that athletes and their participants serve them. And so they don't feel that they need to do anything. And maybe that's me being really pessimistic and cynical, but ultimately we're not creating environments that put them first. We're not creating policies that put them first. We're creating policies that put spectators of sport first. We monetize sport so that the athlete is the product. Not even. The athlete is the recipe in the product. We hear about women's sport being talked about as a product, a product, a product. Well, there's people behind that, and their well-being and welfare is being put at risk in order to create this glistening, glossy product for the spectators. So we need to really shift that paradigm and push forward the message that, yes, as Anne rightly has said, sports organizations serve their participants, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's well said. Glenn, I know you had a thought you wanted to add in there.
Yeah, I just think in sports, schools, elsewhere, youth serving organizations, there will be those who seek to abuse their position of trust, right? Those of you in the UK, I'm sure, have delved deep into the ICSA report and many of the recommendations which still haven't been enacted in the UK, which is a tragedy. I mean, it's arguably a disgrace that there's no mandated reporting and things like that. But you know, there are things organizations can do. You know, I first talked to Real Response a couple of years ago now, I think it was, Blake, and you know, I don't see Real Response only as a way for people to make reports. Have we had anonymous reporting through the real response technology? Yeah, sure. But it's not why we enacted it. We enacted it as a prevention tool. So in every single camp across, so we have hundreds of scouting camps across the nation now. In every single camp, in every single office, there's a poster that talks about anonymous reporting. And it's to send a message to those predatory adults or older youth even, this is not a place for you. You will get caught. And you know, I don't think sometimes people realize that sometimes technology can obviously be for good. And I think there's strength there in terms of telling those very small percentage of people you will get caught, and it's a prevention. So again, prevention's a difficult topic. It's so wide ranging. We've touched on many of them today. But I just wanted to shout out sometimes that technology can help us in this space as well.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I think this time is flying by. If we go over a little bit, that's okay, I think. But I do want to address some of the questions. You have an amazing panel when the panelists are answering the questions in chat already, so that's great. So thank you for that. That's happening. I'll take one here and again just open this for the panel. But Andrew as a party from the ATP, hello Andrew, asks, recognizes there's no global standard. We've talked about that in safeguarding, but you also have cultural differences, depending on the country, wherever anyone's kind of located and the needs there. So balance between safeguarding standards and respecting the local culture. That's a big one. How do you navigate that?
I'm going to say that there are some global standards, although they are safeguards, they've not been put into standards, and I think that's the difference. So we have a description in the international safeguards of what needs to be put in place for children and a set for adults. So that tells you these are the things that need to be there. Where the gap is that isn't operationalized into things that people must put in place, need to put in place, and some clear examples and indicators of what that looks like attached to accountability. That's the kind of thing that I'm hoping is going to come out of the frameworks that are being developed at the moment, because there needs to be both a consistency of the what you need to do with how you put it into place in different environments. So we've got hundreds of organisations around the world that are pledged to implement the international safeguards for children in sport. They've been tested in over 50 different environments, but we still have very little research done on the effectiveness of implementation. So in order to answer the question as to what the model should be, we also need to do some testing and more research on what's actually effective, if that helps. But there are things there to build on where I will actually give a positive example. Somebody asked about concrete examples of innovations and things that have worked. And these for me are nearly always where people have collaborated. So the Council of Europe a couple of years ago, for example, we worked with them on putting those international safeguards for children into a whole country approach. And we tested that with 6 countries where we worked with all the different key stakeholders. We created indicators that were right for a country. That's the kind of model which we need to do and we need to see operationalized. But there has to be consequences. They have to be meaningful, because otherwise it will just be down to those who already are sold into and bought into things.
Thank you, Anne, for that. Just kind of scanning the questions here, and we'll have a couple more, and then we'll close it out. One area that I see, this was a question that came in recently. Glenn, I've heard you speak about this, and this is a sensitive topic. All these topics are sensitive, but understanding, the perpetrators and their motivation. And you talked a little bit about this, those red flags, and some of that. Just in general, this question says, do you think we're missing the trick and not educating about the perpetrators? Just in general, what are your thoughts just around that? I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah, I would say it's both and. Like with a lot of our training, we really try and focus on what the policy is and why it exists. Because if you're not doing both of those things, then I think people are like, well, I don't really understand why we have this policy. So our training really does dive deep into what the policy is and why it exists. Not to take, in this instance, sport or scouting or the positives out of what the activity that's taken place, but but really delving deep into not just being happy with your training, right? Like we have a test that needs to be passed. There's a recurring training every single year, but then we're also working with external organizations to test the knowledge of our membership. So an external organization does a deep dive, and we'll see what results come from that. If there are areas where there's a lack of understanding, well, then we need to increase the training in that aspect. The other thing that we've done recently is an academic level study, again external, to test and question and delve deep with recent youth. So young adults, to Mari's earlier point, who are still developing, but what were their experiences? So again, I know this is a lot, but you have to do a lot if you're going to try and do the best you possibly can in prevention. And of course, like we said earlier, we're never going to be done. There's no destination here. We need to be comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Just make a plug for capacity building as well. I mean, with the IOC certificate course now, which is building capacity around the world in terms of safeguarding, we've had over 400 delegates from 120, I think, countries. That is building a network of people who can share with each other, learn for each other, and really develop the approach to safeguarding.
Yeah, and I think like the IOC course is incredibly important, and to both Glenn and Anne's points, educating about the perpetrators and how they operate is key. Like, and the IOC course covers that, how to spot red flag behaviors in perpetrators. But it's so key, because I think this is part of essentially everything that we do at Caniska is kind of a solution to everything that Kate and I lived ultimately. And now that we are also populated by other people in our organization who have lived experiences, they also feed into what we do, and ultimately we also change what we're doing depending on the people in the support service. And as we kind of grow and as we support more people, we build our education to answer those questions. You know, how do they operate? And you know, I think today I'm not here sitting saying that our education is the best by far. I'm sure there's many improvements that we can make, but ultimately what I've tried to do is answer the questions of, if I had known this, would I have been able to spot it? And I think it's a difficult question to answer anyway, because actually when you're in that experience of abuse, when you're being manipulated, gaslit, coercively controlled, it is very difficult to spot those signs and to disentangle yourself, because that same person that's causing you harm is also doing other things that you kind of tell yourself, oh no, if he was causing me harm, he wouldn't do those things. You know, he wouldn't stand in the rain and time my sessions if he also wanted to, you know, coercively control me and sexually abuse me. So that's obviously a big part of the abuse that's hard to spot. But if you teach other people how to spot those perpetrators, actually it does go a long way. But again, you know, we've talked a lot about quite reactive measures here today, and we know that a big part of how we proactively create better cultures is about how do we create listening organizations? How do we have courage as sporting organizations to not fear safeguarding and to not fear scandals and crisis, and actually lift up that rug and see what's underneath it? And education goes a long way to being a proactive measure.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone, not only with Mari Caniska Advocacy, go to that site. There's a lot of great resources there. I've spent a lot of time on it. So amazing work by you and Kate, certainly there, and it continues. So just closing thoughts. I know we're right up against the hour. We may go a couple of minutes over, which is fine. At the end, there will be a poll for the participants that are following along, where you can request more information from the panelists or to learn more about Real Response. So please hang on for that. Closing thoughts kind of across the board. Anne, we'll start with you.
Thanks very much, Blake. So one thing for me is we want to have greater engagement and sharing of information and sharing of what each other's doing in terms of safeguarding. So I'm going to encourage you to do two things. One is register on SSI Safe Sport Connect to find others who are working in your space. We have a Africa conference, which will happen in April next year, but we have a pre-session in November for 2 days where we're going to engage with everybody who joins into Safe Sport Connects and registered about what they need now in terms of readiness. What do you need to do to put safeguards in place? What do you need help with? So we're going to do a big piece of work on that. Please register and engage with it. But my call to action today is if everyone who's on the webinar today reaches out to somebody they don't know in an organization they don't know, that they're not familiar with, to make a connection, we'll have another 200, 300 connections being made across safeguarding. And it's those connections that keep us all going and enable us to learn from each other and to escalate the work to safeguard athletes and everyone involved in sport. Thank you.
For Mari.
Call to action, so hard. I think listen, be open, but also everyone in this room, you're already the people that are convinced about this topic. You're here because you're engaged, you're here because you care. And you now have the very difficult job of going back to your organization or your community and being that safe sport champion or that safeguarding champion. And so I think what I would say is take care of yourself. That's my call to action. There are so many people trying to take care of people, but nobody's taking care of you. So it's a lonely space, it's a hard space, and it sometimes feels really isolating, but know that you're not alone. There are so many community groups out there, and you have the three of us now. So that's my call to action, which I know is maybe a bit waffly and lighthearted, but it's what I feel like giving today.
Wonderful. Glenn.
Yeah, I don't think it was waffly. I think it's a great point. And you know, giving yourself a break, giving the folks you work with a break as well, right? Sometimes people are like, you know, we know it's an uncomfortable topic, but we must talk about it almost like it's a threat. It's like, look, we know it's an uncomfortable topic. Try and relax mentally, because with that empowering information, we can make a difference. And I'll leave you with a really good example of this with regards the empowering information learned from good training recently saved a 10-year-old who was being sexually abused in the home, right? So the scouter was able to recognize the signs and do something about it because of what they learned in scouting. Now, you might be like, well, that's the minimum I would expect from an adult who'd been trained in a youth serving organization. The most impressive thing about it was the person who made who basically safeguarded this other 10-year-old was her 10-year-old friend. So she was a scouting 10-year-old, learned the right things in scouting, and she was the one who did that safeguarding work. And obviously we couldn't be more proud of her. In scouting, we love patches. So of course she got a lot of patches from the national office here. So she did a great job. So empowerment works, guys, is what I would say.
Yeah, and Glenn, I will say that we do hear that a lot, you know, just through our platform from partners we're working with, where oftentimes it's not the survivor themselves, the victim of abuse. It's somebody that's within their circle coming forward that were hesitant to come forward initially about their friend or their teammate with information like that that's so critical to fighting this problem. So I think we can bring up the poll here. We'll just kind of wrap it up, but I do want to say thank you to our amazing panelists. So Mari and Glenn, you're doing great work. We certainly appreciate it. Appreciate your time today in this conversation. Here you can see just from the poll, if you want to learn more information, if you want to connect with any of the three panelists or myself, then please select this and we'll make sure that we connect the dots here. And something that I learned from our last conference, I know, unfortunately, we did not meet in person at the last SSI conference, but we will the next time, is, you know, it feels like when you have these conversations or you attend a conference, that's it, right? And that call to action that you all just reinforced there, you have to take this conversation, move forward, connect with one another, keep the dialogue going is so critically important. So I'm hoping that people will certainly take that to heart and do that, leaving this conversation, because, you know, I think the theme of this has been safeguarding is not a destination, it's a journey, and part of that journey is keeping the conversation going. So I hope everyone will do that, leaving this conversation. So thank you again to everyone just to take part in this event. Again, more than 300, almost 350 people, I think, registered overall. So there's a lot of interest in this topic. And the hope is we'll keep it going. We'll have more conversations like this going forward. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blake, for
Thank you.
hosting us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much.
Right.